Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into sandals, stepping past sleepy museum guards, and drifting through the echoey marble corridors of history, where statues stare just a little too intently. You stand before a cool, towering figure of a Greek god, carved in bright white marble. His face is flawless, chiseled with serene indifference, his hair a perfect cascade of stone curls. But then you notice something strange. His eyes. Specifically, the irises. They're tiny, comically small. It's as if someone took a perfect statue and then gently poked it with a pencil where the soul should be. It's not just this statue. You wander to another. Same story. A goddess with a noble pose, gazing nobly into the middle distance with pinpricks for pupils. Why, you wonder, did these ancient artists put so much effort into rippling abs and perfect toes, only to flub the eyeballs? You wouldn't last a day as an ancient Greek sculptor. The heat, the dust, the pressure to perfectly carve eyeballs into rock without power tools. It's a miracle any statues survived at all, let alone with intact stares. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I also love seeing where everyone's listening from, so drop your location and your local time in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You start in a museum. Not a fancy, modern one, but a small, creaky one, tucked into a forgotten European city. The lighting hums faintly overhead, and your footsteps echo too loudly on the tile. You've been wandering for a while, past dusty displays and faded placards, and now you find yourself in the classical wing. The air smells faintly of plaster, pine cleaner, and time. The statues are arranged like a silent crowd, some standing on pedestals, some broken into parts. A torso here, a head there. One bust is missing its nose entirely, which seems oddly charming. You pass by a marble athlete mid-sprint, frozen forever in triumph or perhaps cramp. But your eyes keep coming back to the faces. Those little irises, perfectly round, carefully placed, but so small they almost disappear. You lean in. The carving is shallow, the iris barely a whisper of a circle, and the pupil just a pinpoint. There's no expression, no emotion, just blankness, and yet, somehow it works. Now, to be fair, the ancient Greeks probably didn't intend for you to see their statues under flickering fluorescence. These marble wonders were never meant to be white and ghostly. Originally, they were painted in bold, vivid colors. Yes, even the eyes. You can almost picture it now. Deep brown irises, shaded lids, even tiny red blood vessels. But centuries of sun, weather, and cleaning stripped away the paint, leaving only ghostly marble behind. Still, even if the color's gone, the shape remains. And those shapes tell a very particular story. The tiny irises weren't an oversight. They were a choice, a style. A visual whisper passed from artist to artist, chiseler to chiseler, that somehow became the standard. You imagine the first time a young sculptor presented his lifelike statue to his master. Maybe he carved a big, soulful eye, full of emotion, and the master squinted and said, "Too much." Maybe there was an unspoken agreement that big eyes looked silly or too cartoonish. Or maybe small irises just worked better from a distance. More elegant, less intense. You begin to notice the pattern. Male figures with stoic expressions and nearly invisible pupils. Female figures often looking down, their eyes even less defined. There's a strange calm in the uniformity. These weren't portraits, after all. They were ideals. Gods, heroes, muses. Their humanity wasn't in their expressions. It was in their perfect forms. One statue in particular draws your attention. He's headless, of course, but his body is sculpted in meticulous detail. You count the abdominal muscles. 8. That seems excessive. His stance is relaxed, yet somehow powerful. You crouch down, peer into what's left of the face. The iris is barely more than a dent. A tour group shuffles past. A teenager whispers, "Why are the eyes so creepy?" And you can't help but agree, though maybe not for the same reason. They're unsettling, not because they're bad, but because they suggest a different way of seeing the world. A world where a lifelike eye wasn't necessarily a better one. You drift past a statue of a goddess, perhaps Artemis or Athena. Her eyes are only slightly more defined. There's a softness to her expression, a gentleness. The sculptor clearly knew what they were doing. Still, those tiny irises make her look a little distant, like she's gazing at something far beyond you, something you can't see. You wonder what it must have been like to stumble across one of these statues in their prime. Imagine walking into a sun-drenched temple courtyard, seeing them bathed in natural light, colors fresh and vivid. The eyes would gleam with painted detail, the faces full of life. But only from a few feet away. Get too close, and you'd see the trick. The iris is just a flat circle, the gaze only an illusion. Maybe that was the point. The Greeks weren't trying to mimic reality exactly. They were interpreting it, idealizing it, enhancing it. And perhaps they knew that too much realism was distracting. Or worse, off-putting. You pause in front of a statue with an unusually expressive face. His mouth is slightly open, as if about to speak. The eyes, yes, still small, somehow match the energy. There's a subtle tilt to the pupils, a tiny adjustment that makes him look almost aware of your presence. It's a neat trick. You nod, quietly impressed. From across the room, a marble lion watches you. Its irises are, yes, also small. Apparently the rule applied to animals too. No one gets big eyes in ancient Greece. You smirk. Even the lions had to stay classy. You start to feel a rhythm in the silence, a pulse in the stone. Each statue a whisper from a vanished world. And in those whispers, an odd, collective decision about eyes. Not expressive, not intense, just tiny. Tiny and quietly powerful. Morning breaks somewhere in ancient Greece. Not in a grand marble city or a storybook temple, but in a dusty little workshop off a back alley in Corinth. You're standing in a shaded courtyard, listening to the low scrape of a chisel against limestone. A pot of barley porridge simmers nearby. Breakfast for a man who'll spend the next 10 hours hunched over a block of rock, carving biceps and earlobes. You're now this man, or at least you're borrowing his hands for the day. Your fingers are already rough from yesterday, and your back aches in that specific sculptor's way, like a mule with opinions. You shake the dust from your tunic, tie up your hair, and roll out the slab of marble waiting patiently beneath a goat-hide tarp. This one's a commission. A client, probably some middling noble with ambitions of posthumous fame, wants a statue of himself in heroic form, which, as you know by now, means abs, thighs, modest drapery, and a beard that looks like Zeus trimmed it himself. But you can't just start whacking at it with a hammer. First, you reach for the model, a small clay maquette, sculpted with loving detail and very few clothes. It's your rough guide, a miniature prototype to keep your proportions in check. Then come the measuring rods, your battered mallet, and the sharp iron chisels lined up like a surgery kit. There's even a compass of sorts, a bronze divider you use to keep the limbs in harmony. You work slowly. The Greek sculptor's motto, if there was one, might be, "Speed is for the dead." You chip away at the shoulder, then the curve of the arm. Dust gathers on your knees and in your beard. Occasionally, a cicada buzzes too close to your ear, threatening divine retribution. But it's when you get to the face that things get delicate. The nose is always tricky, the lips too. But the eyes? That's where it becomes a meditation. You set the chisel down and squint at the blank face you've been forming. Right now, it looks like a ghost. The sockets are shallow, the brow gentle. You take a fine-tipped tool, more dental pick than hammer, and begin to etch a soft arc into the eyeball. That'll be the top of the iris, then another for the bottom. You barely scratch the surface. Why so small? You wonder, not for the first time. You've seen statues where the iris is deeper, more defined, but they never look quite right. Something too modern about them. Too specific. And besides, making it too detailed invites error. One slip of the chisel, and your noble hero has a lazy eye that will haunt the city square for centuries. Better to suggest an eye than to spell it out. Your master once told you, a strong gaze isn't in the depth, it's in the direction. He meant that even a flat iris could suggest power if the whole head was turned just so, if the shoulders angled toward some imagined horizon. Eyes are only part of the effect. You glance over at another unfinished bust resting in the corner, still missing its eyes entirely. Just blank, polished spheres inside the sockets. It already looks unsettling. You think of the superstitions. There are whispers among your fellow artisans that carving eyes invites attention from the gods, that to sculpt vision is to challenge divine perception. Maybe that's why some sculptors wait until the very end to even touch the eyes. A final breath, a wink at immortality. Your apprentice walks by, carrying a jug of water. He pauses, squinting at your current project. His eyes are tiny, he says. You shrug. He was a very humble hero. The boy laughs, then spills half the water and scurries off. You return to the iris. With a sharp stylus, you add the smallest notch, a pinprick for a pupil. It barely registers unless the light hits it just right. But somehow, it gives the statue just enough presence to feel not alive, exactly, but aware. Around you, the studio smells of dust, lime, and sweat. Tools clink gently against stone. Birds chirp somewhere overhead. The day grows hotter, and your hands grow more confident. You begin to block in the rest of the face. The gentle curve of the cheekbone, the stern mouth, the curl of the beard that suggests wisdom, wealth, and a decent grooming routine. As you work, you remember a story your master told during one of the long carving sessions. There was once a sculptor who made a statue so lifelike, so detailed, that people feared it might walk off its pedestal. The irises were deep, the pupils perfectly formed. It looked human. Too human. One night someone covered it with a cloth. By morning, the statue was gone. Or maybe just destroyed. No one knows. Historians still argue whether that tale was a cautionary fable or a real record of ancient aesthetics gone too far. Some say it was a metaphor for artistic hubris. Others just think it was a prank gone wrong. You don't push your luck. You give your figures just enough soul to be remembered. But never so much that they start asking questions. You wipe your hands on your tunic and step back. The sun catches the statue's eye just right, casting a gentle shadow beneath the brow. Suddenly, he looks almost wise. Maybe heroic. You tilt your head. He's looking just past you, not at you, never at you. And somehow that makes him seem more real. You wander now, not through dusty museums or noisy workshops, but through the quiet corridors of the ancient Greek mind. A place where gods drink wine, people debate philosophy barefoot, and vision, yes, vision, isn't just a physical function, but a whole cosmic event. You look up from your imaginary scroll and realize something. The Greeks didn't see vision the way you do. Not quite. To you, vision is passive. Light bounces off things, enters your eyeballs, hits the retina, and voila. Tree, cat, existential dread. But for the ancient Greeks, sight was more aggressive. In many philosophical schools of thought, you were the one shooting out beams of visual energy. Tiny, invisible eye rays that streamed from your peepers like flashlights, touching and inspecting everything around you. You're basically Cyclops from the X-Men, but polite. This theory was called extramission. And no, it wasn't fringe. It was widely accepted. Plato liked it. So did Euclid, who you may remember from your most traumatic high school geometry experience. They truly believed that seeing was an act of emitting. You look at a vase, and your eyes send beams to greet it. You look at a person, and your gaze touches them. Literally. It's intimate. A bit invasive. This makes those tiny irises on Greek statues feel like a safety measure, doesn't it? You can't have a marble figure sending out beams of cosmic judgment in the middle of a public plaza. People are trying to eat olives and avoid taxes. Better to keep the gaze subdued. A soft, controlled trickle of perception. Barely enough to light up the inside of a temple, let alone threaten a mortal. But there's more. The Greeks thought the gaze had power. Real power. You've heard the phrase, if looks could kill? They almost believed it could. That the eyes, especially the eyes of gods and heroes, could do things. Cause love. Incite fear, inflict madness. One stare from Athena? That's half your sanity gone. You think of Medusa, that poor misunderstood Gorgon with the worst Yelp reviews in all of mythology. One look and you're a statue. Literally. A myth made from the idea that vision is more than passive. It's a weapon. And in that cultural soup, artists tread carefully. So now you return to your marble statues, and the tiny irises make more sense. They weren't just a sculptural challenge. They were a social courtesy. A visual whisper, not a shout. Imagine you're walking into a temple courtyard again. The sun's high, and the statues are arranged in tidy rows. Each one gazes out at nothing in particular. Irises small, pupils indistinct. But you feel them watching anyway. You approach a statue of Apollo. His head turns slightly, chin raised. His eyes are polished smooth except for the faintest hint of an iris, barely more than a ripple in the marble. You lean in, trying to meet his gaze. But he looks right through you. Or maybe past you. The effect is subtle but unsettling. He's not ignoring you. He's just seeing something bigger. The ancient sculptor knew exactly what he was doing. A real, detailed eye might have looked too human, too flawed. The divine doesn't blink. It doesn't squint. It doesn't need eyelashes. There's a word the Greeks used often in their art, sophrosin. It means balance, self-control, moderation. It's what separates the gods from the beasts, and the good statues from the bad ones. An enormous iris would have been indulgent. Vulgar, even. Tiny irises? That's restraint. That's elegance. That's sophrosine in stone. Now walk through the Agora, Athens' busy public square. You pass sculpted heads of philosophers, politicians, and war heroes. Some have stylized eyes, others have barely any at all. And still they feel alive. More alive than if they were staring at you with glassy realism. And here's a fun fringe fact for your sleepy brain. Some sculptors even left the eyes completely blank on purpose. A smooth, unbroken surface within the socket. Why? Some say it was for ease of painting later. Others believe it was a style choice, a nod to the idea that true wisdom doesn't come from outward sight, but inward reflection. Historians still argue whether this minimalism was spiritual, artistic, or just a sign someone forgot to finish their work before the deadline. A gust of warm air drifts past you. You imagine standing in the shade of a stoa, watching the shadows fall across a marble bust. As the sun moves, the sculpture seems to shift expression. A trick of the light. A smile, then a frown. Those tiny irises aren't much, but they're enough. Enough to give suggestion. Enough to avoid intimidation. And yet, sometimes they got it wrong. There are statues with irises carved a little too deep, a little too large. They often look startled, like someone just walked in on them mid-philosophy. You think of one particularly tragic figure in a back corner of the museum. He looks like he's seen a ghost, possibly his own torso. Even ancient sculptors had off days. Or maybe it was the apprentice's turn. You chuckle softly. Then there's the problem of symmetry. Carving two perfectly aligned irises into a curved marble face with hand tools and no measuring lasers? Good luck. One slip and your noble warrior is now a bit cross-eyed, and no amount of sophrosine can save him. So the sculptors kept them small, contained, just enough to evoke awareness without demanding perfection. It was the best compromise. Artistry over exactitude. You rest now, seated on a cool stone bench in the shadow of a forgotten temple. Statues line the walkway like guardians, serene, distant, and very slightly nearsighted. They don't blink, they don't judge, but they are watching. Just not directly at you. The chisel sings again. But this time, the tone is different. You've left the philosophical agora and wandered into the more practical, more splinter-prone world of the sculptor's studio, where art is not born from theory, but from elbow grease and sheer nerve. Picture your tools. Not sleek and polished, but rough, stained, and slightly chipped. Iron chisels, bronze files, a bow drill with a cord you'll inevitably tangle. No diamond-tipped precision here, just hands, muscle memory, and the gentle encouragement of gravity. You run your fingers along a slab of Parian marble, the softest of the hard stones. It's favored for its smooth texture, milky glow, and relative forgiveness under pressure. Even so, one wrong strike and your statue's nose is now a metaphor. The Greek sculptor's day is full of risk. No Ctrl+Z, no second block of marble waiting in the wings. Just you, your hammer, and the slow realization that you should have started on the other side. You begin with a point chisel, outlining the broad planes of the face. Then the claw chisel, which looks like a miniature garden rake, for refining shape and removing the awkward potato phase of sculpture. Flat chisels come next, smoothing edges, coaxing out cheekbones. For the eyes, though, the eyes, you need something finer. Enter the drill. Now, we're not talking Black & Decker. This is a slow, steady hand drill, turned with a bowstring like you're starting a fire. You hold it perpendicular to the eye socket and begin to bore. Gently, patiently. Maybe you mark the iris location with red pigment first. Maybe you freehand it because you're bold and underpaid. Either way, it's a gamble. This is how many of those tiny irises started. Not with a chisel, but with a hollow drill tip that created a perfect little circle. Controlled, contained, hard to mess up, theoretically. The problem? Marble is a diva. Veins can suddenly shift. Microfractures hide beneath the surface, waiting to betray you. One crack, and the iris becomes a crater. So sculptors learned to keep it minimal. No deep gouges, no showy tricks. Just enough to catch the light and give the illusion of focus. Even with those precautions, errors happened. Statues ended up with oddly shaped eyes, uneven pupils, or that special brand of deranged expression that says, "I've seen things." These mistakes were rarely corrected. Better to pretend it was intentional. Maybe the patron wanted a hero who looked surprised at his own success. You think of a legend often whispered in carving circles, the tale of a famed statue of Hera, whose irises were drilled slightly off-center. Instead of looking proud and regal, she appeared to be watching something behind her. A vase, perhaps. Or her ex. No one dared to fix it. They just adjusted her display position. Historians still argue whether this sort of error was accepted as part of the handmade charm, or whether apprentices were quietly reassigned to less sensitive body parts, like feet or the back of the head. Then there's the issue of time. A sculptor might spend weeks on the body, rippling muscles, flowing robes, perfectly balanced drapery. By the time they reach the eyes, they're tired, hungry, and haunted by the fear of ruining everything at the finish line. So they tread lightly. Small iris, tiny pupil, dust hands. Move on. You wander through a workshop in full swing. One sculptor carves a satyr, his wild expression frozen in mischief. Another works on a serene goddess, the kind whose eyes are so subtle you wonder if she's even awake. A third artist mutters to himself, trying to fix a lopsided stare with a file the size of a toothpick. There's banter in the air, jokes about broken noses, bets on how long before the next tool snaps. Someone drops a mallet. Someone else sneezes and ruins a perfect toe. You chuckle softly. Ancient art wasn't all solemn silence and marble reverence. It was a noisy, dusty job site, full of trial, error, and occasional swearing. And then there's the fringe stuff. Every workshop had that one guy who tried to reinvent the eye entirely. Maybe he carved his irises as deep, swirling spirals. Maybe he added little incised eyelashes. One even tried a double pupil design, claiming it was visionary. His statue now lives in the back room. Under a tarp, you sit for a moment beside a half-finished head, the iris freshly drilled. It looks simple, clean, almost too easy. And that's the genius of it. When done right, that tiny mark brings a marble face to life without begging for attention. It's restraint, it's grace. It's a sculptor knowing exactly how much to say, and when to stop talking. You run your thumb across the cooled surface of the statue's cheek. You try to imagine finishing the other eye, matching the pupil's size, angle, and depth with nothing but instinct and light. You quietly decide to leave that job to someone else. Because the truth is, those tiny irises aren't there because the sculptors couldn't do more. They're there because they knew when not to. You're back in front of the statues again. Same marble, same stoic expressions. But now, armed with a little workshop wisdom, you look at their eyes differently. And tonight, we follow a trail. The moment when sculptors, patrons, and even viewers started to notice something peculiar. The iris problem. It begins quietly, subtly. You stand in a dimly lit portico beside a statue of Heracles, arms crossed, lion skin draped across his shoulder like a bath towel. His torso is a masterpiece. Every muscle is an ode to masculine bravado. But then you reach his face, and there it is again. Tiny, almost apologetic irises. You tilt your head, then circle to the other side, hoping to catch a different angle. Maybe it's the light. Maybe he just has really deep-set eyes. But no. No matter where you go, those pupils stay small and aloof. Like he's watching a very distant pigeon. And now you can't unsee it. Statue after statue. God, mortal, philosopher, athlete. They all share that same tiny dot. It's the kind of visual quirk that once noticed gently hijacks your attention for life. You wonder, did anyone in the ancient world ever say, "Hey, are these eyes a little too minimalist?" Turns out, yes. There are records, faint and patchy, of sculptors experimenting with more realistic gazes. Occasionally, someone would push the boundaries, carve a deeper iris, shape a rounder pupil. Maybe even, brace yourself, use inlays. Thin discs of colored stone or glass set directly into the eye socket, like some kind of ancient contact lens. But it didn't always go well. Imagine walking into a temple expecting divine serenity, and instead, being met with a statue that looks like it's about to ask for your mother's maiden name. The Greeks valued harmony, symmetry, a concept they called kalokagathia, the beautiful and the good, merged in perfect union. Anything that felt too much disrupted that ideal. And an over-detailed eyeball? That was definitely too much. So the iris problem, this artistic tightrope, became something of a standard hazard. Every sculptor faced it. You wanted your statue to feel present, aware, but not intense. You wanted him gazing nobly toward eternity, not staring down a squirrel. And so, over time, sculptors developed tricks. One of the most popular? Carve the iris small, yes, but then use angles and light to fake a deeper gaze. They'd tilt the head ever so slightly, turn the eyes off-center, polish one side of the iris to catch just a hint of reflection. These illusions gave life without detail, mood without commitment. It's like the marble equivalent of a Mona Lisa smile, calculated ambiguity. Still, the occasional critic, or overly confident patron, wanted more. In one surviving anecdote, a wealthy merchant requested that his likeness include eyes as full of spirit as mine. The sculptor reportedly smiled politely, then gave him the most lifeless marble stare you've ever seen. Sometimes, art answers back. Historians still argue whether sculptors were held back by tools, by taste, or by taboo. Did they avoid large irises out of reverence? Or was it just fear of looking weird? After all, once a face looks too human, it starts edging into the uncanny. There's a reason mannequins give you the creeps, and it wasn't just Greek sculptors dealing with this balance. Egyptian artists had their own stylized eye designs, outlined boldly with cosmetic flair. In the East, early Buddhist statues carried eyes that glowed with spiritual wisdom, but rarely realism. Everyone was trying to solve the same riddle. How much eye is too much? You stroll past a statue of a youth holding a discus. His body is frozen in pre-throw tension, muscles coiled, hair swept back in soft curls. His face is calm, his eyes small and distant. And you feel it again. That sense of purpose. Not blankness, not emptiness, but quiet. He's not staring at anything, he's staring through. You imagine the sculptor, pausing over the eyes. He holds the stylus just above the marble, breathes deeply, and makes the first mark. A single arc, then a faint circle. The pupil is barely a fingerprint. But it's enough, because to the Greeks, the iris wasn't just an anatomical feature. It was an invitation to imagine, a prompt, not a pronouncement. And in that simplicity, the statue becomes yours. You walk away slowly, past rows of figures, each one watching in their own quiet way. And you begin to appreciate the genius of restraint, the power of suggestion, the deliberate decision to do less so that your mind can do more. Those tiny irises aren't a failure of technique. They're an elegant solution to an impossible task. After all, how do you carve the soul into stone? Now that you've walked among those marble figures, stood under their blank stares and tried to decode their mysterious quiet, you begin to realize something unsettling, something nobody tells you on the museum audio tour. Those statues? They weren't meant to look like that. You're not seeing what the Greeks saw. Not really. You're seeing ghosts, because those milky white statues, the ones everyone associates with ancient Greece, all soft light and noble monochrome, were once painted. Yes, painted. Vividly, unapologetically, sometimes garishly. That solemn philosopher bust you admired in Section 2? He probably had red lips, brown eyebrows, glossy black pupils, and just maybe, if the artist was feeling fancy, a touch of gold leaf across the eyelids. That serene goddess in flowing robes? Imagine blue eyeliner, painted irises, and perhaps even a blush of rouge on the cheeks. Suddenly, those tiny irises make a lot more sense. You look again at a statue's eye, not just the carved shape, but the canvas. A surface to hold pigment, not stand on its own. The sculptor's job was only half the story. The painter, often a different artisan entirely, would come in later to finish the illusion. And the smaller the iris, the easier it was to control expression with a touch of paint. Marble, in this way, was not the final product. It was just the underpainting. In some cases, the eyes weren't even carved at all. Just a smooth bulge, waiting for paint to do the heavy lifting. You squint at an old Kouros figure now, one of those early, smiling statues that look like they're eternally amused by an inside joke, and you imagine it in full color. The skin a warm ochre, the hair jet black, the eyes ringed with dark lines, the irises painted in with coppery brown and a tiny dot of white for shine. And then you blink, because it's kind of creepy, which might be why modern museums don't always show you this side of ancient art. When archaeologists began discovering traces of pigment on statues, faint smudges of red and blue clinging to eyebrows and robes, they tried recreating the paint jobs. The results? A bit like a cross between Barbie, a wax figure, and a very committed Renaissance fair attendee. The public, expecting cool, serene marble, recoiled slightly. But the ancient viewer? They would have expected nothing less. In fact, temples would have been full of color. Gold, blue, crimson, green. Eyes weren't just detailed, they were vivid. Some even had painted eyelashes and eyebrows, carefully shaped to flatter the figure. And the technique wasn't random. Artists used specific mixtures, pigments like Egyptian blue, red ochre, yellow made from arsenic minerals, and black from soot or charcoal. Binding agents might include egg yolk, beeswax, or even tree resin. Yes, that's right. Some statues stared at you with eyes painted in what was essentially ancient mayonnaise. Historians still argue whether the original colors were meant to be realistic or symbolic. Was that blue eye shadow on Artemis supposed to reflect her lunar nature? Or was it just what looked good in temple lighting? In some temples, priests even periodically repainted the statues, touching up the pupils, freshening the lips. In others, eyes were adorned with actual inlays, precious stones, metals, or glass inserted into carefully carved sockets. These were expensive, rare, and almost never survived. But on special cult statues, especially those of gods, the eyes would have glittered. You imagine entering a dim sanctuary, torches flickering on polished gold, and the eyes of Athena shining back at you. Literal divine presence. Not bad for a face carved in 450 BCE. And then there's the ambient light. Most Greek statues stood outdoors, bathed in natural sun. That means the tiny iris, when polished, would catch light just so, gleaming faintly, moving subtly as you passed by. A clever artist could manipulate that, even without paint, to create the illusion of a shifting gaze. The Greeks knew this. They played with shadow, polish, color, and form like a visual symphony. Nothing was accidental. But of course, time ruins everything. Sunlight bleaches. Rain wears down pigment. Birds do unspeakable things. And when Renaissance artists started digging up old Greek statues, what they found were weathered, bare forms. The paint was gone, but the beauty remained. So they assumed that this was the point. White marble, pure form, eternal calm. They didn't realize they were seeing the statue in its pajamas. And thus began the great Western art misunderstanding. That Greek statues were always white, always minimal, always serious. You know better now. You look again at those tiny irises, those modest little circles barely carved into the marble, and you see not restraint, but anticipation, waiting for a painter's brush to bring them to life. It's like finding an empty outline in a coloring book and realizing it was never meant to stay empty. In a quiet museum room, You now picture what once was: full color, golden pupils, dark lashes. And suddenly, the gaze feels warmer, more human, less ghostly, less distant. You imagine walking by a statue in its original paint, its eyes bright and confident, and for just a second, it looks at you. Not through you, not past you. At you. Let's drift now into a different kind of temple. Not one built of marble or gold, but of memory. Because for all their technique, their tools, and their pigments, Greek sculptors were ultimately in the business of storytelling. And the eyes? Those tiny irises were the punctuation marks, the places where narrative pauses and breathes. You find yourself standing in the middle of a city square in 5th century BCE Athens. The stone beneath your feet is warm. The air carries the smell of roasted garlic, sheep dung, and fresh figs. The agora hums with life. Merchants call out prices. Philosophers argue about metaphysics while barefoot, and nearby, standing tall on a raised plinth, is a statue of a general. His face is calm, proud. His tunic billows in an imaginary breeze. His spear is long gone, snapped or stolen, but his stance is still ready for battle. You squint up at his eyes. And yes, there it is again. Tiny irises. But now you start to wonder, why here? Why this man? Because this isn't just a portrait. It's propaganda. It's performance. This general may have been brave, or just rich. He may have led a dozen campaigns, or simply paid for a temple roof. But once that statue went up, his image became part of the city's permanent imagination. And the eyes? They do a clever thing. They don't stare down at you in dominance. They don't roll upward in divine disinterest. They look out, just a little to the side, as if watching over something larger than themselves. Like destiny, or a tax reform. This visual trick, this compositional sleight of hand, was part of a broader sculptural philosophy. The Greeks weren't trying to depict individuals with photographic realism. They were creating types, archetypes, the wise old statesman, the brave hoplite, the thoughtful youth, and tiny irises helped keep the mood generalized, universal. Because once the gaze becomes too focused, too specific, it stops being everyone's statue and starts being just his. So you stroll through the square, and every statue you pass becomes a moment frozen in marble, a gesture, a scene. And the tiny eyes serve like ellipses, quiet markers that say, you fill in the rest. You approach a seated figure, perhaps a poet. His hand rests lightly on a lyre. His head tilts as if listening for a melody only he can hear. His gaze is lowered, thoughtful. The irises are barely there, just soft circles etched into time. And suddenly you get it. These aren't blank stares, they're invitations. Sculpture, to the Greeks, was not just about image. It was about presence. The statue stood in the public square, not as a monument to what was, but as a companion to what is. That poet isn't thinking alone. He's inviting you to think with him. That general isn't watching the horizon for enemies. He's asking you to share the burden of vigilance. The eyes don't command. They offer. Historians still argue whether this was a conscious artistic philosophy or just the result of practical limitations. But the result is the same. Statues that don't dominate their viewers, but gently accompany them. And the placement of these statues? That mattered too. A lot. You round the corner of the agora and find another figure. This one tucked beneath an olive tree, sunlight flickering across his shoulder. His pose is casual. One hand on hip, one foot forward. His gaze? Slightly turned, directed toward the temple of Hephaestus just up the hill. You trace the line of sight, from his tiny iris to the grand stone steps. And for a moment, you feel what the sculptor intended. This man was watching over the gods, or waiting for them to notice. The statue isn't just a body in space. It's part of a silent dialogue. One sculpture glances at another. A cluster of figures might all turn their heads toward an invisible procession. Their irises, small as they are, create invisible lines across the city, weaving a visual map of relationships and reverence. And then there were the viewers, the Athenians, the ones who knew how to read these signs. Because in a culture that prized rhetoric, theater, and civic participation, reading a face was part of daily life. The way a statue angled its gaze, tilted its chin, or slightly arched an eyebrow. That wasn't just decoration, that was language. You walk past a statue of a young man standing in contrapposto. One leg bent, hips tilted, weight shifted in that lazy summer afternoon sort of way. His eyes look off to the right, toward a marble stele inscribed with the names of the dead. He says nothing, but his pose and those barely visible irises speak volumes. He's not watching you, he's remembering them. And in that moment you remember too, because that's the magic of these tiny, humble irises. They let you project your own story onto the face. They give you space to feel. They do not grab your attention. They whisper, they suggest. And that whisper has echoed across centuries, from crowded agoras to silent galleries, from sun-drenched temples to softly lit museums. The gaze endures. Small, quiet, and oddly comforting. You stand still for a while, not thinking, not analyzing, just letting your eyes meet theirs. And for a second, just a second, you understand. You drift again. This time away from the cities, away from the noise and politics of Athens, Corinth, and Delphi. You find yourself in a windswept sanctuary on a rocky coastline, somewhere remote, sacred, somewhere the marble is not for display, but devotion. Here, the statues aren't made to impress dinner guests or intimidate rivals. They are offerings, sacred images for the gods. They stand in alcoves, in groves, in tiny rural shrines, where the only audience might be a priest, a goat, and the wind. And here too, yes, even here, you find those small, careful irises. A statue of Artemis stands near a spring. Her expression is cool, distant, and something in her blank-eyed stare makes the back of your neck tingle. She doesn't need to see you clearly. Her power is not in her pupils, but in her stillness. But this setting, removed from the bustle of cities, changes how you perceive her gaze. Out here, the quiet amplifies. The subtle curvature of the brow, the shallow arc of the iris. They become louder in the silence. You remember now that these statues weren't always meant to be seen in broad daylight. Many lived in shadow, in flickering torchlight, under thick canopies, or in the semi-dark of temple interiors. In that glow, those tiny irises came alive. You imagine holding a small oil lamp, walking past a row of votive figures deep inside a sanctuary. The light dances across their faces. And suddenly, that faint depression where the iris sits becomes dramatic. A catch of shadow turns a static face into something that watches. Maybe that's why they carved so little into the eye. Because the rest would be done by flame and imagination. And not just imagination, ritual. Because in sacred contexts, the eye was more than anatomical. It was spiritual, a point of divine contact. The Greeks had a concept called entheos, to be filled with the god. And statues, especially those that lived in temples, were often believed to carry that divine spark. A statue's gaze wasn't always inert. In certain ceremonies, it was active. You recall the Theoxenia festivals, occasions when gods were thought to visit through their cult statues. These images would be clothed, fed symbolic meals, even paraded through the streets. Their eyes, however tiny, were treated as living instruments. It sounds quaint now, but in the moment, very real. A priestess might kneel before a statue and feel its gaze as guidance. A supplicant might weep under those blank pupils, convinced they were being seen, not judged, but witnessed. And the artists understood this. Even if their chisel marks were minimal, their intent was deep. They weren't just crafting bodies, they were building vessels. And every decision, from the turn of the head to the size of the iris, was made with that in mind. You picture a sculptor assigned to create a new statue of Apollo for a small coastal temple. He's not thinking about fame. He's thinking about presence, about how the god will be seen, and how he will see. He knows the statue will be placed in a niche, facing east, where the rising sun will glance across the eyes each morning. So he carves the irises shallow and polishes them smooth, just enough to catch the dawn light like a blink. And perhaps he adds a tiny dot, an incised point for the pupil, right at the center. So when the sun aligns, it glows. Not by pigment, not by paint, but by geometry and hope. Historians still argue whether these alignments were intentional or just the result of artistic intuition. But when you stand in front of a temple statue at sunrise and the eye glints just so, it's hard to believe it was chance. You imagine the early morning rituals, the way villagers might gather to lay offerings at Apollo's feet, the way the statue's gaze, fixed yet somehow awake, might feel like an answer. And maybe, just maybe, those tiny irises were never meant to show power. Maybe they were designed to show listening, not eyes that judge, but eyes that absorb, that receive. You think of all the whispered prayers, the pleas for rain or healing or justice, spoken in front of these unmoving faces. And you begin to wonder, could those tiny eyes, left so deliberately unfinished, be a kind of mirror? You lean closer to a statue in this imagined sanctuary. The eye socket is cool, the iris barely more than a depression. But in the right angle, with soft enough light, you can see your own reflection. Faint, blurred, but there. And you think maybe that's the point. The gods don't see you in detail, they see you in essence. And maybe statues, like prayers, work best when they don't say too much. You've seen the temples, stood in the public squares, wandered through the sculptor's studio. But now, let's step indoors, somewhere quieter, a little dustier. You're in the home of a moderately wealthy Athenian, the kind who brags about his olive press and always seems to have extra figs on hand. And nestled on a shelf, just above eye level, is a small personal statue. Maybe of Hermes, maybe a bust of a deceased relative, maybe even a clever hybrid, a sort of uncle as demigod situation. It's a domestic space, not sacred, not civic, and yet the eyes remain the same. Tiny irises. You wonder again, why? These aren't for temples. They're not huge, not part of a public ritual. Why wouldn't the artist go all out? Add more detail? Make the eyes fuller, deeper, alive? But no, the same restraint applies. Even here, in the comfort of home, the iris remains modest, quiet. Because these statues too had rules, social rules. You turn slowly, taking in the modest courtyard, the mosaic floor, the lizards scuttling across sun-warmed tiles. In a room off to the side, a young woman kneels to refill an oil lamp. Her shadow dances on the wall. The statue watches from its shelf. And you realize something strange. The less attention the eyes demand, the more freely you give it. In other words, those tiny irises make the statue less intrusive. It becomes part of the space, not the centerpiece. It shares the room rather than dominating it. The gaze doesn't grab you. It allows you to return to it again and again without discomfort. You imagine the statue of Hermes now, his eyes painted but faint. Maybe the paint's flaked away over time. Maybe it was never applied. Either way, the gaze feels restful, present but passive, like a book on a shelf, always waiting, never demanding. And this was important in the home. Greek households were private but not silent. They bustled with tasks, arguments, lullabies, rituals. A statue that stared with detailed, intrusive eyes might have been too much, a distraction, a discomfort. So the artists softened the gaze. They kept the iris small, the pupil implied. Even the head's tilt was usually passive. Historians still argue whether this was a cultural aesthetic or simply functional design. But there's a deeper current here. The role of presence in Greek domestic life. The Greeks didn't compartmentalize art into sacred and secular quite the way we do. A statue at home wasn't just decoration, it was memory. It was honor, sometimes even protection. A household might have a bust of a lost father or a figure of a fertility goddess tucked discreetly beside the loom. These weren't just objects, they were witnesses. And again, those tiny, quiet eyes made them easier to live with. There's a term used in modern museum studies, glanceability. It refers to the way an object invites brief, frequent attention rather than long, intense stares. Greek domestic statues? Masters of glanceability. You picture an Athenian father walking past the family shrine after a long day in the agora. He glances up at the bust of his brother. A half-second of eye contact. Just enough to stir memory, to offer a small nod of connection. No pressure, no drama, and the sculptor knew this. Knew how to make the eyes feel soft. Knew how to sculpt just enough to suggest awareness, but not judgment. Even in funerary art, stone reliefs that lined grave plots or adorned tombstones, the gaze is subdued. Figures parting from loved ones, their eyes downcast, or turned gently outward, never piercing. You sit now in front of one such grave relief, imagining the family who commissioned it. A daughter stands holding a dove. Her mother sits, reaching toward her. Their eyes? Slightly incised. Painted, perhaps, or simply left shallow. The moment is tender. Still. And here too, the power of the tiny iris plays out. It lets the scene be gentle, lets grief be bearable. You trace the arc of this design decision, from public hero statues to quiet household busts to the most intimate memorials. In every context, the same principle holds. The less detail in the eye, the more space for the viewer. It's an open window, not a fixed stare. You rise from your imagined stool in the Athenian home and step into the hallway. Outside, the sun is setting. Long shadows stretch across the floor, and for a brief moment, one falls across the bust of Hermes. And in that light, the tiny iris catches a glint. Not bright, not sharp, just enough. You've wandered through temples, workshops, and homes. But now, we take a slight detour. Away from where the statues were first carved, away from where they stood tall and whole. Tonight you walk into a space filled not with gods or generals, but with fragments. You're in an archaeological storeroom. Cool, dry, silent except for the creak of floorboards and the distant drip of water echoing off stone. All around you, shelves are stacked with limbs, torsos, chipped toes, and disembodied heads. It feels like walking through a dream someone half remembered. And everywhere you see eyes. Some are intact, carefully excavated. Others are barely more than sockets, the iris worn smooth or broken off. A few still show traces of paint, faint reds, ghostly blacks, a touch of blue clinging to the upper lid like leftover eyeliner from a long-forgotten festival. And suddenly you realize, to understand the story of those tiny irises, you also have to understand what happens to them, because time is not kind to marble, especially not to faces. Think of it. Those eyes are shallow, just a few millimeters of depth, if that. A couple centuries of wind, rain, war, and religious zealotry. Poof. Gone. You pick up a small head of a youth, broken at the neck, nose chipped, ears long vanished. But the eyes remain. One iris slightly deeper than the other. the kind of asymmetry that drives art historians to happy tears. And yet what's truly strange is how complete the head still feels. Even broken, even blind in one eye, the expression is unmistakable. Calm. Focused. Human. You realize now that the sculptors knew this might happen. Knew their statues would age, would crumble, would outlast the gods they were meant to resemble. So they carved simply. They carved with durability in mind. Historians still argue whether the tiny iris was a stylistic choice or an act of insurance. The less you carve, the less that can break. It's functional minimalism. You pass by a row of boxed heads, each labeled with excavation coordinates and a string of numbers. One of them is a warrior, helmet long gone, but his gaze still fierce. His irises are little more than shadows, gentle scoops in weathered stone, but they stare through time with conviction. You wonder who he was. Not the model, the sculptor. Did he know his statue would one day sit in a padded drawer under flickering fluorescent lights? Did he imagine a future where a stranger would kneel and peer into his warrior's tiny eyes and think, yes, this man had purpose? Or maybe not. Maybe the sculptor just wanted to make sure the pupil didn't crack off before payday. Either way, the result is the same. That small iris, subtle, careful, timeless, survives. Not in grandeur, but in whispers. You run your fingers gently across a fragment of a female face. The mouth is gone, the cheek chipped. But the eye? It remains. Barely there, but unmistakable. A single tiny arc that still holds something soft. Maybe mercy. Maybe mischief. And then there are the statues that were meant to be broken. You find a tray labeled ritual fragments, full of intentionally shattered pieces, offerings left at sanctuaries, arms, legs, heads, all rendered incomplete on purpose. It was a form of devotion. You give the god a part, not the whole, a token of yourself. And even in these pieces, yes, even here, the irises are carved. Small, thoughtful, a detail no one would ever see once buried, once placed in the ground or hidden in a temple crevice. Why bother? Because it mattered. The eye, no matter how small, was sacred. It was the part that watched, that witnessed. That turned a lump of stone into something that knew it was being held, even if only for a moment. You sit down beside a large wooden crate filled with heads, some upright, some sideways, some face down in soft cloth. You imagine them as a council of silent watchers, each eye small, each one carved by someone who, at some level, believed that what we look at and how we're looked at matters. It's comforting, in a strange way, to know that even after the bodies break, the gazes endure, and that 1,000 years from now someone else may pick up a fragment, hold it to the light, and see what you see. A glimpse of care, a moment of presence, carved not for attention, not for spectacle, but for connection. You're sitting now with all that history around you. Fragments, faces, forgotten eyes. So maybe it's time to ask the question that's been quietly blinking at the edges of your mind for hours. Did everyone in the ancient world go along with the tiny iris trend? The answer, as with most things in history, is a gentle shrug followed by a whispered, not quite. Because just when you start to think you've got a handle on the whole Greek sculptural situation, someone comes along and throws in a curveball. That someone? The Hellenistic period. Ah yes, the drama queens of ancient art. The Hellenistic era, roughly from the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE to the rise of Rome, was when Greek art decided to get a little extra. You walk into a gallery now that's full of Hellenistic sculpture. The vibe is, well, different. Where earlier classical art whispered, Hellenistic art leans in and sings. Where classical sculptures stood still and noble, these ones twist, flail, sob, smirk. And the eyes? Let's just say the irises have made a bit of a comeback. They're still carved small, yes, But now you're seeing more depth, more daring. Some sculptors begin pushing the boundaries, using deeper cuts, sharper lines, and more dramatic pupil placement. They want you to feel what the statue feels. Take the famous statue of Laocoon and his sons. If you haven't seen it, imagine 3 men being dramatically eaten by sea serpents while still managing to look like they're in a shampoo commercial. The expressions are pure agony, and the eyes? Wide, intense, the irises clearly carved with swirling chaos. You stand in front of it now, watching Laocoon's face twist in despair. His pupils seem almost to vibrate. The detail is precise, but the effect isn't calming. It's cinematic. This was the shift. The Hellenistic period wasn't afraid of feelings. Fear, ecstasy, fury, drunkenness. It was all fair game. And the eyes had to match. Even smaller, more private works reflected this emotional range. A statue of a sleeping satyr lies curled, mouth open slightly, brow furrowed. His iris is carefully incised, turned downward into dream. You can almost hear him snoring. This was a big step away from the old serenity. And of course, this being the ancient world, not everyone was thrilled about it. Some critics, yes, even back then, complained that sculpture was becoming too theatrical, that emotion was overtaking elegance, that these new statues felt too much. Historians still argue whether this was a true stylistic revolution or simply a matter of wealthy patrons wanting art that popped at parties. But whatever the cause, the result was clear. The iris was back in fashion. And then came Rome, because Rome took what Greece had done and said, "Hold my amphora." You find yourself now in a Roman villa. Grand, echoing, a little ostentatious. The walls are painted with fake columns, the ceilings with fake skies. And in the center? A bust of some senator. This man has opinions. You can tell because his eyebrows are carved like lightning bolts, and his irises are not only incised but drilled. Yes, drilled. Roman sculptors developed a technique of using a fine drill to carve deeper pupils and iris rings into marble. It added dramatic shadow, crisp depth, and sometimes even made the eyes look glassy or wet. The effect is bold, but not always beautiful. You look at a Roman bust with its over-drilled eyes and get the sense that it's less noble gaze and more, this man hasn't slept in 3 days. Still, the trend stuck, especially in portraiture, where capturing likeness became the holy grail. The eyes had to do more than suggest presence. They had to prove it. Some busts even have irises so carefully rendered that the direction of gaze is unmistakable. A senator looking smugly left. A matron staring wistfully into the middle distance, probably wondering if the grapes are ripe yet. And so you trace this journey, from barely there Greek irises, to Hellenistic emotional drama, to Roman optical precision. And through it all, a central tension remains. How much should the statue look like it's looking? Too little and it feels distant. Too much and it feels unsettling. Somewhere in between lies the sweet spot. And for many, that sweet spot was still closer to the quiet, whispering gaze of the early Greek iris. You step back from the Roman bust now, letting your eyes blur just slightly. And again you feel it, the tiniest depression, the gentlest ring, a symbol, not an instruction, a suggestion, not a stare, the human eye reduced not to detail, but to its essence. A moment of contact, fleeting and infinite. So far we've walked with generals, prayed with priestesses, and sifted through broken marble heads. But tonight, let's take a quieter turn. Not to the famous faces of myth and empire, but to something a little more humble. The Chori. You find yourself standing beneath the portico of an ancient sanctuary, perhaps on the Acropolis of Athens. The air is cool. The scent of crushed thyme and old stone clings to your tunic. And there before you stands a line of young women. Not living ones, but statues, dozens of them. The Chori, plural of kor, meaning maiden, are sculpted girls caught in mid-step, mid-smile, mid-thought. They hold offerings, fruit, birds, wreaths. Their robes are carved with impossible delicacy, the folds flowing like spring water down marble limbs. And their faces? Peaceful, almost amused. You walk past them slowly, studying the eyes. And there they are again, tiny irises, sometimes just softly incised, sometimes only painted. It's strange at first. How little they demand of you. No aggressive stare, no emotional pleading, just quiet companionship. You find one with an especially warm expression. Her mouth slightly open, as if about to whisper a joke only she understands. Her eyes are understated, small irises gently angled downward. She isn't looking at you. She's just existing. And maybe that's the whole idea. These were not statues of gods or rulers. They weren't meant to overwhelm. They were votive figures, gifts to the divine, placed in temples as offerings of gratitude, protection, and sometimes status, but not ego. Historians still argue whether these korai represented real people, daughters of wealthy citizens, maybe, or whether they were idealized types, pure symbols of femininity, piety, and youthful grace. Either way, their eyes tell you the same story. That being seen was not the point. Being there was. You kneel in front of one now, watching how the early morning light catches the ridge of her iris. Just a suggestion of an eye, a small curve, a trace of brownish paint lingering after 2,500 years. She doesn't blink, of course, but she doesn't feel frozen either. She feels settled. And that subtlety? That's where the real magic lives. Because Greek sculptors weren't just shaping figures, they were curating presence. And presence is delicate. A hard stare can break it. Too much detail becomes noise. But a slight touch, like a tiny iris in a polished face, invites you in. You reach out and imagine brushing dust from her cheek. And you wonder, what was it like to live among these figures? Not as a visitor, but as a worshiper. Imagine being a young Athenian girl, perhaps 13, brought here with your family. You're holding a basket of barley or pomegranates, and your mother points out the statue she helped dedicate when she was your age. You look up into its tiny eyes, knowing it's been standing here for years, seeing thousands of visitors come and go. And though it doesn't look back, it feels aware. Not like surveillance, like memory, a stillness that remembers. And perhaps that's why the iris was kept so subtle. Because these statues weren't supposed to see the world. They were supposed to hold it. Quietly. Other cultures, you might recall, took the opposite approach. Egyptian statues often had deeply inlaid eyes made of obsidian or glass, hyper-realistic, dazzling, almost startling. Mesopotamian statues stared like they'd just discovered espresso. But Greek korai? They observe without watching. You notice now how similar their expressions are. Not identical, but kin. The same serenity, the same suggestion of life without its demands. And those tiny irises serve like the smallest of brush strokes, just enough to say, I'm not asleep. It's a kind of visual breathing. And in a way, this reflects something deeper about ancient Greek thought. The balance between logos and pathos, reason and emotion. These statues sit right on the edge of both. They feel alive, but they're not trying to. They don't perform. They exist. And the irises? They don't try to convince you of anything. They just are, like the sea brushing the shore, like wind through cypress, like dreams you half remember when you wake up. You step out now from the calm hush of the sanctuary, from the rows of korai with their whispered gazes and silent memories, and walk into something louder. Not louder in sound, but in symbolism. Because it's time to visit the heroes. Not the real ones, necessarily. Not the guys who actually fought and maybe got hit in the shin with a spear and limped home to their sheep farm. No, these are the sculpted heroes, idealized, ageless, forever flexed and ready for battle. And naturally their eyes are small. You enter a gymnasium. Not like the sweaty, neon-lit places of today, but a breezy, columned courtyard with polished flagstones and the scent of laurel. Here, young men train for war and for sculpture. Yes, sculpture. Because let's be honest, half the point of all that exercise was to be immortalized in bronze later. You wander past rows of statues modeled after these athletic youths. They're perfect, absurdly so. Each muscle rendered with reverent attention. The posture? Confident but composed. The hair? Windswept but sculpted. And the eyes? There it is again. Tiny irises. You pause at one. A discobolus mid-throw. His body twists with tension, his limbs frozen in potential energy. And his face? Calm. Detached. Focused somewhere beyond the horizon. It's not the face of a man about to break a sweat. It's the face of an ideal. And that's the point. Greek heroic statuary wasn't about realism. It was about arete, a kind of perfected excellence that went beyond strength. It was moral, mental, even spiritual. So the tiny iris? A conscious tool. Too much detail would break the illusion. You don't want your champion looking distracted or overly emotional, or like he's just remembered he left olives burning at home. You want him eternal. Historians still argue whether this aesthetic was shaped by cultural ideals or just artistic conventions passed down through generations of apprentices and masters. But as you move from one heroic figure to the next, the pattern holds. The body is exaggerated, the face is minimal, and the eyes? Understated to the point of mystery. You stop in front of a statue of Heracles. The mighty hero leans on his club, a lion skin draped over one shoulder. His torso is vast. His beard is meticulously carved. But his gaze? Soft. He isn't glaring. He's thinking, maybe brooding. And again, the tiny iris works its magic. You aren't told what to feel. You're invited to imagine. In this way, even the boldest heroes share something with the Korai. They give you room to project, room to interpret. You realize something else now. These statues weren't meant to be seen from just one angle. They were walked around, glimpsed in motion, passed by daily. That's where the tiny iris shines. Because as you move, so does the expression. A statue that looks proud from the left might seem pensive from the right. From below, almost divine. From above, almost bored. It's the ancient equivalent of mood lighting. And it's all thanks to restraint. The sculptors knew they didn't need to chisel every capillary into the eye socket. They just needed to carve enough to let light and angle do the rest. It's hard not to admire the confidence in that, especially in an era obsessed with perfection. You think of all the statues that once lined gymnasiums, theaters, sanctuaries, places where the public gathered to admire, to emulate, to judge. The eyes of these heroes didn't flash or glare. They waited, and because they waited, they endured. You look once more at Heracles. The paint has long faded, the bronze gone green in spots. But the iris, barely more than a shallow disk, still glints under the torchlight of your imagination. You smile a little, because here is a man who once strangled a lion with his bare hands, and now gently watches you doze off. You've met heroes, gods, maidens, and mourners. But now let's take a stroll through a very different corner of the ancient world. One a little further from Athens, a little dustier, a little more Egyptian. Welcome to Ptolemaic Alexandria. It's the 3rd century BCE. The sun is heavy, the sea breeze thick with salt and foreign spices. Alexandria is a marvel, a cultural crossroads of Greek, Egyptian, and Persian traditions all folded together under one royal ego, the Ptolemies. And here, art gets interesting. You walk into a quiet museum hall, and what greets you is not purely Greek, not purely Egyptian, but something hybrid. Statues that look like they were carved in a philosophical identity crisis. Greek forms with Egyptian hairstyles, Egyptian gods with Greek tunics. And most confusing of all, the eyes. You step up to one of these fusion figures, perhaps Serapis, the strange Greek-Egyptian mashup god invented by Ptolemy I. His face is smooth, serene, Grecian in structure. But the eyes? They're big, not cartoonish, not exaggerated, but larger than the typical classical iris. Bolder, fuller, and perhaps even a little more detailed than you're used to. Why? Because in Egypt, the eye was everything. It was a sacred symbol. The Eye of Horus wasn't just decorative. It was protective, mystical, and deeply woven into funerary practices. So when Greek sculptors began working in Egypt, they adapted. You imagine the sculptor now, a young Greek craftsman, probably raised in Athens, suddenly transported to Alexandria. He's carving in the court workshop, glancing nervously at the overseer. He knows how to do soft irises. Understatement is his thing. But the overseer wants something more Egyptian, something bolder, so he experiments. The iris gets a little bigger. The pupil gets drilled, maybe even inlaid with stone or pigment. The face stays Greek, but the gaze? That starts to lean toward the Nile. Historians still argue whether these changes were mandated by royal decree or simply the result of artistic osmosis. But the evidence is there. In this multicultural swirl, the eye began to shift. And not just physically, symbolically. In the Greek world, the eye was a passive presence, a placeholder, a space for the viewer to fill. But in Ptolemaic Egypt, the eye became active. It warded off evil. It watched over the dead. It wasn't just looking, it was doing. You walk past a statue of Isis, now rendered in a more Hellenistic style. She wears Greek robes, stands in the contrapposto pose. But her eyes? They are unmistakably Egyptian. Large, defined, deeply incised. She doesn't just watch, she commands, and standing there you feel the difference. A tiny Greek iris invites you in. A big Egyptian iris looks through you. You wander further, into a small side room. Perhaps a shrine, perhaps a workshop archive. Here, the statues are more intimate. Busts of noble women, minor gods, even animals. And again, the eye motif varies wildly. One bust has mismatched eyes, one incised in the Greek style, one painted in bold Egyptian lines. You wonder, was it an error or a deliberate blend? The ancient world wasn't as cleanly divided as textbooks sometimes suggest. Cultures bled into one another. Art borrowed, revised, repeated. And in this little moment, this odd bust with hybrid eyes, you feel the truth of it. That even something as small as an iris carries the weight of empires. It's not just a dot in stone. It's a cultural signature. You sit for a while, surrounded by these Greco-Egyptian figures. Some gaze softly, others sharply. And you realize something comforting, that no matter the size of the iris, whether barely visible or carved with dramatic flair, it always meant the same thing. I am here. I am present. I am aware. I am part of this world. And maybe that's what matters most. Not how the eye was made, but that it was made at all. You leave Alexandria behind now, brushing off the desert wind from your cloak, and drift toward another, less celebrated setting. One that's not grand or royal, but deeply human. You're standing now in a graveyard. Not a scary one, not a Halloween one. A peaceful, sun-drenched necropolis outside a modest Greek polis. Here, the stones are humble. Low reliefs carved into marble slabs. Not statues, but markers, memorials. And yet, those eyes again. You approach one steely. A woman reclines on a chair, her hand extended to a servant, or perhaps a daughter. There's a moment of farewell caught forever in stone. You can almost hear the rustle of fabric, the quiet breath of goodbye. And the irises? Tiny, gentle, as if the sculptor knew that grief doesn't need to be shouted. These funerary reliefs didn't aim to immortalize greatness. They captured tenderness, stillness, a man offering a bird to his young son, a grandmother clasping hands with a child, a woman gazing outward, not with despair, but with a soft patience that seems to say, "It's all right." And across them all, the same visual strategy, the eye rendered as a calm presence, sometimes just a curve, barely deeper than a thumbprint, other times filled with pigment now long faded. Historians still argue whether these works were mass-produced using stock templates or individually designed to honor specific lives. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Standard poses with personal touches. But even if the pose was repeated, the emotion never quite was. Each one feels specific, and that's thanks, in large part, to the eyes. Imagine standing at one of these stones as a mourner. You've come to visit someone you loved, your mother, your friend, your spouse. You don't want drama. You want connection. You want to feel seen, even in your silence. And the sculptor gives you that. Not with weeping angels or dramatic gestures, but with a small, thoughtful eye. It's this restraint that holds the power, because the more muted the iris, the more space there is for memory to bloom. You picture one figure in particular now, an old man seated with his dog by his feet. His face is plain, weathered, but his eye? Just a small arc and a dot. That's it. And somehow, it's enough. You see warmth. You see recognition. You see a lifetime in that tiny ring of marble. Even dogs, you notice, are occasionally carved with similar attention. Not cartoon eyes, not oversized ovals, but the same minimal curves. As if the sculptor believed that even an animal deserved that gentle dignity. You step back from the row of reliefs. The sun is lower now, throwing long shadows. The eyes of these silent figures catch just a bit of gold, like memories flickering at the edge of sleep. You think again about how the Greeks approached death, not as an end, but a transition, a soft fading rather than a sharp break. Their funerary art doesn't scream, it sighs. And the tiny iris? That's the sigh in visual form. It lets the face remain calm. It allows the spirit to remain present, not hovering, not haunting, just nearby. Some graves are unmarked now. The stone chipped, the names gone. But if you look closely, sometimes an eye remains, a faint depression, a whisper of gaze, and it tells you, across millennia, someone lived, someone was loved, someone looked back. You leave the necropolis with slow steps, your thoughts quieted by centuries of farewell. But don't drift off just yet. There's another world waiting. Tonight, we descend into the workshop, not the grand temple studios or the glittering courts of kings. No, this one's smaller, tucked away down a stone alley behind a taverna that smells like fish stew and yesterday's wine. You're in the studio of a modest sculptor, not famous, not poor, just busy. His tools are spread across a long bench, chisels of varying width, bronze scrapers, a wooden mallet polished by years of use. A lump of fine-grained marble rests in the center, just starting to resemble a human face. And now, you see the moment we've been circling this whole time. He begins the eyes. You crouch behind him. Not that he minds. This is bedtime history after all, and you've become quite good at ghosting through these scenes unnoticed. With a practiced hand, he marks 2 circles into the marble. Not big, not flashy, just there. The placement is everything. Too high, and the figure looks surprised. Too low, and you've got ancient ennui. He taps gently, shaping a tiny hollow. Then another. The irises, just a few millimeters wide. Not enough to cast a shadow, but just enough to suggest direction. He steps back, squints, scratches his beard, then nods. That's it. That's the moment. The decision is made, not to show everything, not to impress with depth or precision, but to imply, because sculpture is a game of restraint, And this artist, like so many of his peers, knows the truth. The viewer finishes the work. Historians still argue whether sculptors followed strict iris templates or were taught through an oral tradition of just enough, but not too much. But the evidence suggests incredible consistency across centuries and cities. And here in this little shop you see why. The tools haven't changed much. The materials haven't either. But what has evolved, what matters, is intention. This artist isn't just carving for beauty, he's carving for effect. He knows the statue will be placed in a courtyard, maybe beside a fountain, maybe in a darkened hallway. And so the iris must adapt to light, to shadow, to emotion the stone doesn't possess, but must somehow reflect. He takes a fine brush now, dipped in faint pigment, ground from iron oxide and soot, and dots the incised iris. Not a full fill, just a hint of color. It barely shows, but it changes everything. Suddenly the face has focus, not intensity but presence. You're amazed by how little it takes. It's like that one candle in a dark room. It doesn't flood the space, but it tells your brain there is life here. He stands back again, satisfied, and you notice how much else he's left undone. The mouth is only half finished. The hands, still rough. Even the robe has more stone than fabric in it. But the eyes? The tiniest part, and the most complete. Because once the eyes arrive, the statue feels born. You can almost hear it inhale. He wraps the figure in a linen cloth, gently, like tucking in a sleeping child. The statue will dry now, if painted. Rest, if bare. Tomorrow a patron will come, but for tonight it stays here, with you. And those tiny eyes, soft, unblinking, keep you company in the flickering torchlight. You glance at the sculptor one last time. He's washing his tools, humming some tune you don't recognize. Something old. Something shaped by rhythm and stone and silence. And maybe that's the melody the iris follows too. Not the song of vision, but of suggestion. Not the truth of sight, but the comfort of being seen just enough. You let that idea settle into your breath. Small eyes, big story. Back on your feet, dreamwalker. The scent of marble dust still clings to your imagination, and your mind's eye still holds the glow of that quiet workshop. But the story isn't finished. Not yet. Tonight, we journey into another medium entirely, because not all ancient Greek eyes were carved. Some were painted. You find yourself now inside a dimly lit room. Not a temple or a tomb, but a home. A modest one, tucked into the shoulder of a hillside somewhere near Corinth. The walls are plastered and faintly painted. The floor is packed earth, swept clean, and on a shelf, pottery. Stacks of bowls, vases, and drinking cups, some practical, some playful, some made for the solemn hush of ritual. And painted on nearly all of them, eyes. Wide, staring, symbolic, comical. Tiny irises sometimes, yes, but more often big ones. And now the roles have reversed. Because while sculpture used tiny irises to calm, these painted pots, they want your attention. You pick up a kylix, a broad drinking cup with two curved handles. It's terracotta red, with a black figure scene of a satyr dancing on one side, and aha! Two big painted eyes on the outside. What's going on here? Well, for starters, it's a party trick. Imagine sipping from this cup at a symposium. As you tilt it to drink, the eyes appear over the rim, turning your face into a sort of mask. You become the cup becomes you. And those painted irises? They're not modest, they're theatrical. Some even had details like eyelids, lashes, or dots meant to represent reflection. Not subtle, not serene, but wildly fun. This isn't divine gazing, it's party art. Still, historians argue whether some of these designs were purely decorative or carried ritual meaning. After all, the eye cup wasn't just for laughs. It may have offered a kind of protection, warding off evil during drinking rituals when spirits ran high. You pass by more pottery now, amphorae showing athletic competitions, craters depicting weddings, processions, and shipwrecks. And in so many of them, the eye appears. Not just the functional eye of a painted figure, but symbolic ones. The Greeks were fascinated by the gaze. To see, to be seen, to see yourself being seen. And pottery was where that fascination could be playful. You kneel beside a small lekithos, an oil jar used in funerary rites. On its side, a woman stands beside a tomb, her eyes lowered, her iris just a flick of dark glaze. So tiny, so quiet. And suddenly you're back in sculpture territory. Here too, the painter holds back, suggests. You realize now that the scale and function of the object often dictated the eye's treatment. On ritual vessels, big protective irises. On intimate scenes, soft, reduced ones. It's the same artistic philosophy, just rendered in brushstroke rather than chisel. You can almost picture the painter at work, hunched over the pot, a reed brush in hand. One quick flick for the eye shape, another for the iris, maybe a dot, maybe a dash, maybe nothing at all, and still, somehow it breathes. You pick up another kylix. This one's more abstract. Geometric shapes, stylized faces. The eyes are huge, filling half the cup. The irises are concentric rings, almost hypnotic. And you smile, because somewhere between the playful and the profound, the Greek artist always found a way to remind you the eye is a mirror. And sometimes that mirror needs only the lightest scratch to reflect your thoughts back at you. You're getting good at this, moving through centuries like warm mist, slipping between stone and silence. And now, it's time to talk about something many ancient art guides skip over entirely. The eyes of statues that weren't meant to last. Not the heroic bronzes or temple-bound marbles, but the ones made of clay, wood, wax, cheap materials, common craftsmanship, forgotten in almost every museum brochure. You're walking now through a dusty village. It's nothing fancy. Chickens cluck somewhere in the distance. Children chase each other between olive trees. And inside a simple home, you see them. Little statues, figurines. Some sit on shelves, others tucked into corners. Some lie buried beneath offerings of fruit or oil. They aren't life-sized. They're not meant to impress. But they matter, because these were the statues of everyday devotion. And yes, they had eyes. Tiny ones, sometimes painted, sometimes scratched in, sometimes just the barest indentation in a soft material like terracotta or wood. You pick up one now, gently. A small clay figure of a woman holding a child. Maybe Demeter and Persephone. Maybe just a mother and daughter. Her eyes are two shallow dimples. No more. But still they work. Because even here the iris wasn't forgotten. Historians still argue whether these figurines were household gods, childhood toys, or simple charms. But all agree they were omnipresent, found in nearly every layer of Greek daily life. You see another, a small satyr, grinning mischievously, holding a wineskin. His eyes are almost crossed, two little bumps with dots. It's funny, crude, maybe even endearing. And this is where the story of the iris takes a surprising turn. Because unlike grand statues meant to awe, these smaller objects didn't need the restraint of subtlety. They were practical, fast to make, designed for meaning over perfection. Yet even so, the eye remained a key feature, a priority. Why? Because it gave them life. A statue with no eyes, it's just an object. But add an iris, however wonky or wobbly, and it becomes a presence. You sit with a family now. Dinner is over, the lamps are lit. A young girl clutches a small figurine. A horse, maybe. She turns it in her hands, smiling at its little face. The eyes? Just two scratches. But in her imagination, they gallop, they blink, they know her. This was the beauty of everyday Greek art. It understood the power of suggestion. You don't need realism to believe, you just need enough. And these eyes, tiny, inconsistent, ephemeral, still carried meaning. Even funeral figurines, buried with the dead, had eyes. Small ones, quiet ones, just enough to accompany a soul through the underworld. You pause by one now, unearthed centuries later. The face is worn, the form nearly crumbled, but the iris remains, somehow, just a whisper of a curve, a dot of color where the glaze still clings. And it tells you something extraordinary, that even in obscurity, even in anonymity, someone once cared enough to give this figure sight. Not for seeing, necessarily, but for being seen. You close your eyes for a moment and picture the entire workshop that must have produced these. Rows of terracotta bodies, still damp, their eyes being added one by an apprentice with a simple reed. Tap, dot, blink. 1,000 little irises, none perfect, all alive. They weren't made for kings. They were made for comfort. And maybe, in a strange way, those humble eyes are the most meaningful of all, because they weren't there to impress. They were there to stay. By now, your inner art historian is fully activated. But don't worry. The pace stays slow, the breeze stays warm, and the marble dust still glimmers in the corners of your thoughts. Tonight, let's wander into a topic that's often overlooked but oddly important. The role of copying in all of this. Yes, copying. Not plagiarism, not fraud, just reproduction, replication, the ancient version of Ctrl+C, chisel style. You find yourself in a Roman villa now. Not Greek, exactly, but Greek adjacent. The Romans, ever practical, ever thirsty for culture they could display in their atriums, had a particular affection for Greek art. And when the real thing wasn't available, or had inconveniently stayed behind in Athens, they did the next best thing. They made copies. Dozens, hundreds, full-body sculptures, busts, reliefs, and of course, the eyes. So now, here's the question. When a Roman sculptor recreated a Greek statue, did they also copy the tiny iris? The short answer, yes, but with a twist. You stroll into a sculptor's workshop in ancient Rome. It's bustling. Apprentices fetching stone, assistants mixing wax for cast models. In the center, the master sculptor stands over a marble torso, hammering gently. He's working from a Greek original, perhaps one looted during some imperial liberation, or perhaps just a plaster cast from Athens. Either way, he follows it closely. The pose, the proportions, the flowing hair. But when he reaches the eyes, he pauses, because now he has a choice. Does he keep the soft, incised Greek iris, the understated one? Or does he make it more Roman, more drilled, more shadowed, more direct? Historians still debate how much interpretation Roman artists allowed themselves in these moments. Some copies are shockingly faithful, others go a little rogue. You examine two busts side by side now. One features a delicate iris, small, curved, barely there, clearly mimicking the Greek original. The other? Well, the iris is deeper. The pupil has been fully drilled, and the gaze feels stronger, more assertive. Still elegant, but less dreamlike. The difference is subtle, but meaningful, because while the Romans loved Greek aesthetics, they also loved personality. Portraiture was their specialty. They wanted likeness, specificity, mood. So while they copied the form, they often amplified the eye, made it darker, sharper, more communicative. You remember now that many surviving Greek statues are, in fact, Roman copies. And that means a lot of those gentle irises we see in museums today may be Roman approximations of Greek originals. In other words, your entire concept of tiny Greek irises might have been filtered through a Roman lens, literally. And now your mind begins to hum with the implications. Were Greek statues even more subtle than we thought? Were Roman eyes trying to give ancient serenity a little extra drama for a Roman audience? Maybe. You wander now through the Villa of the Papyri in Herculaneum, a house buried by Vesuvius but miraculously preserved. Busts line the halls, philosophers, generals, poets. Their eyes are varied. Some hint at Greek restraint, others flash with Roman clarity. And you feel something odd, a visual dialogue across centuries. One iris-style nods to the other. Not quite imitation, more like inheritance. And in this moment, you realize something important. That even the act of copying can be creative. Even the smallest curve of an iris can carry centuries of taste, training, and translation. Because every sculptor, Greek or Roman, made a decision. How much to show, how much to suggest. And that choice, repeated over and over in dusty studios and candle-lit halls, became the history you now trace with your sleepy gaze. Tiny eyes, endless echoes. Let's drift now from marble and clay into something even softer. Myth. But not the grand fire and thunder myths. Tonight we're headed to the quiet ones. The ones that whisper rather than roar. Because in ancient Greece, not all eyes belonged to statues. Some belonged to monsters, to gods, to shadows at the edge of olive groves. And yes, even their irises had stories. You step now into a moonlit clearing, cicadas humming like distant static. A circle of stones marks the edge of a sacred grove. You're alone, but you don't feel unwatched. Somewhere, someone, or something is looking. Take Argus Panoptis. You might remember him, the 100-eyed giant. Guardian of Hera, famously hard to sneak past. Each eye blinked in turn, never all at once. A walking surveillance system. But ancient vase paintings? They depict him as a single-bodied figure with dotted skin. Each eye was drawn as a little circle, no more than a painted iris with a black dot. Not hyper-real. Not scary. Just a suggestion. You're being seen. In Greek myth, the eye was never just anatomy. It was power. The evil eye, or Bascania, was feared deeply. You could curse someone just by looking at them the wrong way. So what do? You paint eyes. On drinking cups, on shields, on boats. You carve tiny irises into amulets shaped like faces, or append them to jewelry meant to deflect attention. Eyes that stare back, so that envy can't land on you. And now you're back in a bustling agora. A woman sells terracotta pendants, some shaped like owls, some like eyes. You pick one up. The iris is huge, overstated, laughably bold. But that's the point. It's protection by parody. Meanwhile, in the temples, different eyes watched you. Apollo's statues often had that cool, unbothered gaze. Eyes that knew but didn't care to explain. Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, was depicted with clarity. Eyes often a little larger, a little more alert. Some cult statues were said to be miraculous, their gazes alive. You weren't supposed to meet their eyes directly. You bowed, you lit incense, you looked away. Historians still argue whether these statues were treated as vessels or literal incarnations of the gods. But in either case, their irises mattered. Too large, and they felt mortal. Too small, and they vanished into abstraction. So they balanced. You stand now in a shrine to Hecate, goddess of crossroads, magic, and things better left unspoken. Her statue is triple-formed, 3 women back to back, facing all directions. Each face is different, each pair of eyes slightly varied, and the irises? Smaller than you expect. Not ominous, just aware. It makes sense. Hecate didn't need to see like mortals. She already knew. You move to another myth now, one you may not have heard. The Grey. 3 sisters who shared one eye between them. Not 3 women with bad vision. Literally, one eye. They passed it around to take turns seeing. And when Perseus stole it, that was their moment of true blindness. Their eye wasn't just a tool, it was identity. And you wonder, what did it look like? Some say it was large, luminous. Others imagine it as a shimmering sphere, maybe even magical. But most depictions? A simple eye. One iris. Not flashy. Just meaningful. Because myth has a way of simplifying, reducing things to symbols. And the iris, the tiny, carved, painted, imagined iris, became a symbol for divine knowledge, mortal fear, and everything in between. Even the fates, those spinners of destiny, were sometimes said to see with more than mortal vision. Did their statues have small eyes too? Or were they kept blank, the way some early figures had no pupils at all? A scholarly debate that still rolls through sleepy university halls. But here, in your quiet seat beside the sacred grove, one truth is clear. The Greeks didn't just sculpt eyes to decorate faces, they sculpted meaning. And sometimes that meaning was divine. A little dot of pigment, a carved ring in stone. That's all it took. A god could watch, a curse could land, a sailor could feel safe at sea. The iris wasn't just part of the art. It was the story. You're still floating on the edges of myth when the setting gently shifts again. This time, it's not a workshop or a temple or a village shrine. It's somewhere stranger. Welcome to the museum. But not just any museum. This one exists partly in the real world and partly in the fuzzy haze of sleep. A museum of memories, of half-remembered lectures and audio guides you never quite finished. You wander its hushed corridors barefoot, because of course you do. The marble is cool, and the lights are low. And everywhere, eyes, statues from every corner of ancient Greece, arranged with reverence, but also a faint hint of confusion. Because here's the thing. Many of these pieces are incomplete. Limbs missing, noses chipped, bases gone. But the irises? Somehow they survive. You pause at a headless Kouros. A strong, idealized youth, muscles still firm despite the millennia. His face is missing, but the left eye socket remains, and inside it, carved with astonishing delicacy, is the iris, just a partial ring, just a whisper of vision. And still, he looks at you. You keep walking. Past Athena in battle armor, past a weary philosopher with a furrowed brow, past a goddess whose hand once held a dove. Their irises tell different stories, but they all share the same principle. Small, subtle, sacred. You notice now how the lighting changes the effect. From the side, the face looks serene. From the front, focused. From above, contemplative. It's not just sculpture, it's stagecraft. You pause beside a glass case. Inside is a tiny head, just a fragment from a larger funerary relief. The marble is cracked, the nose long gone. But the eye? Still there. And more than that, it seems aware of your presence. Historians still argue whether ancient sculptors accounted for modern lighting conditions when carving their works. Obviously not. And yet, the designs still function, still whisper, still invite you to fill in the blanks. Now, in the farthest gallery, you find something rare. A statue that still holds traces of original pigment. Most Greek statues were painted, but the color rarely survived the centuries. This one, just barely, has red around the lips, black lining the eyebrows, and a faint, dusky brown where the iris used to be. And suddenly everything clicks. Because this tiny iris, preserved in mineral and time, completes the illusion. You aren't looking at a statue anymore. You're meeting someone. Not a god, not a hero, just someone. And that's the magic of the museum. It shows you how little is needed to bridge centuries. A curve, a shadow, a hint of pigment, and your mind fills the rest. You sit now, quietly, in the middle of the gallery. The eyes don't blink, but they don't have to. They've seen empires rise and fall. They've been dug from ruins, shipped across seas, stared at by school children and sleepy tourists alike. And still they speak, not loudly, not with certainty, but with presence. You think back on every statue you've seen tonight, heroic, domestic, divine, ridiculous, and realize the iris is where we meet them. Not just to look, but to connect. So small, so easy to miss, but always there reminding you. Art doesn't need to shout. Sometimes it just needs to see. Now we come to the softest part of the story. The quiet curtain call. Not the climax, not the reveal. Just the long, gentle exhale of a history well told. And we're better to end than where most Greek statues began. In the mind of a young sculptor, sketching. You find yourself now not in a museum, nor a ruined temple, but in a dim room lit by an oil lamp. The flame dances, throwing soft shadows over the parchment. There, hunched over a wooden desk, is a student. Not yet a master, not yet in marble. He's sketching a face, one line at a time. He begins with the brow, then the nose, then the curve of the cheek, and finally, yes, the eyes. He doesn't draw them in detail, just two gentle outlines, a faint circle within each, barely more than a whisper. The irises are tiny, and even on paper they carry weight. You imagine him pausing, wondering, should he go darker? More dramatic? No. He sticks to tradition. A small iris, understated, elegant. He was likely taught this way. That restraint is a virtue. That the more you leave unsaid, the more the viewer must participate. Historians still argue whether students were explicitly instructed to minimize the iris, or whether it was simply absorbed from the master's hand. But the pattern is clear. Less is more. You watch the young artist lean back and admire his sketch. He's tired. He rubs his eyes. The real ones, not the drawn ones. And then, satisfied, he sets down the stylus. His statue doesn't exist yet, but in that tiny pencil-drawn iris it already lives. And it makes you think, how many thousands of these faces never made it into marble? How many irises were dreamed up and lost, like candle smoke curling through a courtyard window? You step outside now. The night air is warm. The sky is scattered with stars, each a tiny point of light, distant and delicate, like irises in the heavens. You realize you've spent this whole time tracing something incredibly small. But that's what history often is, a mosaic of minute decisions, a flick of the chisel, a stroke of a brush, a choice not to deepen the iris by a single millimeter. And all of it, every small, sleepy decision, adding up to a legacy that spans continents and centuries. You return, just for a moment, to that first statue, the one with the nearly invisible eyes. You stand in front of it now, like you did so many imagined hours ago, and it still doesn't blink. But it sees you, not with drama, not with judgment, just with presence. The presence of the past, the stillness of stone, the comfort of being looked at by something that expects nothing from you at all. Not attention, not interpretation, not even awe, just presence. Now let your shoulders drop a little. Let your breath slow. You've wandered through workshops and groves, temples and tombs, tracing the tiniest details carved into the smoothest stone. And somehow, something as small as an iris has carried us all this way, from divinity to daily life, from myth to memory, from Athens to Alexandria and back again. Maybe you started this journey out of curiosity, or maybe you were just trying to fall asleep. Either way, you've made it here, to the very edge of waking. You've learned that silence isn't empty, that even the quietest statue still speaks, that a face made of marble can offer comfort, if only you pause long enough to meet its gaze, and that small things, soft things, matter more than we give them credit for, especially when the world is loud. So take one more breath. Let the light dim further until the images blur at the edges of your mind, until the echoes of ancient footsteps fade into the hush of your own slow heartbeat. You're safe, you're still, you're seen, even if only by a sculpted eye no bigger than a thumbprint, even if only by a voice whispering gently across time. Rest now. The statues will keep watch. Good night.